Captain Pickings, of the USS Charleston, wrote to the Navy Department on February 8, 1984. Quote, "The Akidaban was sighted coming in, not flying the Admiral's flag. She was fired at by Altaforts and stood towards and anchored near the Tamandre, returning fire, but only occasionally, with her large guns. It was a remarkable sight to see this vessel come in before all the forts and batteries, and seemingly without any injury at all. I hear from a good source that she was struck twice, but without material injury."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have a story? The twice sunk Akidaban.
Here we are. Enjoy!
It had been a dramatic series of events that had led to the batteries and forts of Brazil to fire on a ship that had been their pride. The Akidaban was a 4,950-ton ship that had been built for the Brazilian Navy in 1885 in Poplar, England. She had a steel hull, but below the waterline the steel was encased in wood, which was in turn sheathed in copper. The Akidaban was the first modern warship that Brazil acquired, being rated as a battleship, and was therefore the flagship of the 3 ships that Brazil dispatched in April 1893 for a naval review in New York City. In the end, the smaller but brand new Tiradentes, a small gun vessel, garnered more attention from the naval experts that wandered the event, but having chosen the Akidaban as the flagship for an international show of naval power spoke of how highly the Brazilian Navy thought of the vessel. In June of 1893, the Akidaban set sail from New York to return to Brazil. Things were not particularly stable in Brazil as they returned. In May, Admiral Melo resigned as Minister of the Marine, a dramatic move since Admiral Melo had played an active role in establishing the current government as part of a movement in 1891. Admiral Melo now found himself disillusioned, however. Stepping down from his position as Minister of the Marine was only a sign of what was to come. On the 6th of July, Admiral Wandenkalk, who had retired from the Brazilian Navy, seized a ship in Montevideo with some followers, took a few more ships, and called for people to join him in the name of liberty. They were swiftly captured, and Admiral Wandenkalk was forced to surrender, but Admiral Melo would soon follow in his steps. On the 6th of September, it was reported that Admiral Melo had assumed control over war vessels, and stated that unless the vice president resigned, they would bombard Rio de Janeiro. The Navy and a few Congress members stood with Admiral Melo, and soon it was known internationally that there was a rebel fleet sailing the coasts of Brazil, consisting of the Akidaban, the Jupiter, and the Republica. The next several months would bring skirmishes between the rebellious naval vessels that were keeping close to the harbor of Rio de Janeiro and the forts of the city. Shots were fired back and forth on occasion, but as things dragged out, the rebellion was losing steam. The support that they had hoped for never materialized. In spite of this, the Akidaban was showing why she had been the pride of the Brazilian Navy. It was estimated that on one occasion, the batteries on shore had fired 100 shots at her, and they had only succeeded in denting her. She had sailed from the harbor without anything but cosmetic damages. In February, a large portion of the forces of the rebellion surrendered, and in April, the Brazilian government sent its ships out to hunt the Akidaban. They had captured information that told them what movements to expect from the rebel fleet, and they went to meet them. At midnight, on the 16th of April, 1894, the Navy fleet began to fire on the ships under rebel control until at 2 in the morning, a signal was sent for the torpedo boats to attack the Akitaban. The Gustavo Sampaio was able to get very close to the Akitaban before they were noticed, due to it being a dark night. But when they were noticed, they opened fire immediately. The Gustavo Sampaio's first torpedo under this fire failed to hit the Akitaban. Her second torpedo did strike, hitting the Akitaban on the starboard side under her forward turret. As soon as the Akitaban was hit, she stopped firing and began a swift retreat. The torpedo boats returned to the fleet, which anchored, the rebellious fleet having been driven off. They were preparing to hunt down the Akitaban again on the 18th when the German corvette, the Arkona, found them and let them know that the Akitaban had gone down due to the torpedo strike in shallow water and had been abandoned at Santa Catalina. There would be some debate about whether or not it was actually a torpedo that had caused her to sink. Another version said that she was instead in bad condition by April 16th, and that, while turning sharply, she had accidentally run aground, leading to her being abandoned. Whatever the reason, it would spell the end of the revolt. Melo sought asylum in Buenos Aires. Meanwhile, the Akitaban would soon be refloated and return to the folds of the Brazilian Navy. How easy she was to refloat was used as evidence that the torpedo had not sunk her. Reportedly, she was in surprisingly good condition. The Akitaban was initially renamed the 16 de Abril, after the date of the engagement that had led to the end of her career under Admiral Melo. The name did not last, and she would be renamed again, this time to the 24 de Mayo, before returning to her original name of the Akitaban. She was already sailing under the name Akitaban again when she sailed for Germany in 1895, where she underwent full repairs and restoration, as well as complete modernization. She would continue in her role as one of the most important ships in the Brazilian Navy. It was, therefore, no surprise that on January 21st, 1906, the Akitaban, at the time the second largest ship in the Brazilian fleet, was selected as an escort for the cruiser Barroso. On board of the two ships was a prestigious group of people. The Barroso was carrying the Minister of Marine and his staff. The Akitaban, meanwhile, was carrying 3 admirals. The purpose of the trip was to inspect Ilha Grande Bay, where it was proposed that a new navy base be built. The two ships anchored within half a mile of each other at Port Jacarepaguá, and the people on board settled in for the night. At around 10:40 at night, First Lieutenant Cabral, who was in charge of the ship's batteries, told the other people on the deck that he needed to prepare the ammunition for salutes for the next day, and he headed towards the magazines. Whether or not he ever reached the ship's magazines is unknown, but it would later be considered one of the few clues as to what happened that existed. Most of the people on the ship were asleep. The Akitaban was described as being comfortably appointed for the comfort of its powerful guests, and many of the high-ranking naval officers were reportedly seated around a table talking about ceremonial details for the next day when disaster struck. At 10:45 at night, a sudden and massive explosion in the area of the aft turret rocked the ship, followed by several minor explosions as shells and ammunition went off due to the fire. 4 of the officers were in the wardroom, and they were thrown violently off their feet by the blast. Captain Pinto and a lieutenant had a pit of flames open in the deck under their feet, into which they fell. But the other 2 managed to crawl to a port where they were able to throw themselves out of and drop into the sea. The ship's doctor also escaped through a porthole. A servant who served Rear Admiral Graca rushed to his cabin and begged him to throw himself overboard as well. The servant explained that he was able to swim and that he could keep both of them afloat. Rear Admiral Graca refused, however, saying that the danger was over. The servant, on finding that the man he served would not follow him, threw himself overboard, which saved his life. Only a few seconds later, the Akidaban sank, taking all 3 of the admirals on board with her, as well as most of the rest of her crew. Many of the people who did end up in the water were dazed and confused about what had happened, having been thrown in the water by the explosion or having jumped when they realized the ship was sinking, with no chance to take stock of the situation. It was estimated that it only took 3 or 4 minutes at most for the Akidaban to sink after the blast. For the people on the Barroso, the explosion on the Akidaban was also a shock. It was a dark night, but they had seen her outline only minutes before, seemingly in no distress at all. Now there were people screaming for help in the water. The Barroso quickly launched boats and began the rescue work. In total, they were able to save 98 people, with over 30 of those people having injuries. 212 people had been lost in the explosion of the Akidaban, including almost all of the officers. There would be a large national funeral for those who had been lost on the Akidaban, with flags being flown at half-mast in recognition of the tragedy. Soon, the attention would turn to what had happened, however. It was such a mystery that people were still puzzling over it and studying the explosion in 1926, trying to discover if anything had been missed. There was a theory that a boiler had exploded, and that had set off the magazines, but this was put into doubt when 2 lieutenants who survived and were questioned both said that they had not seen any steam. They had heard a rapidly rising shriek that was immediately followed by explosions. Divers were employed and sent to dive the wreck and report back what they had found. They reported that the damage to the boiler room was much more severe on the side with the powder magazine, suggesting that the magazine had exploded first, not the other way around. The next theory that was put forward was that the problem had been the stability of the cordite. The powder, it was found, had been manufactured for the Akidaban in 1898 by the Chilworth Smokeless Powder Company. That meant that at the time of the explosion, it had been 8 years old, certainly enough time for it to become volatile in theory. But there would never be any evidence of instability in any of the chemical tests on the powder that was retrieved by the divers. The Boletim do Clube Naval of Brazil still came to the conclusion after looking at all the facts that they believed that the explosion was due to spontaneous combustion of the cordite. The high-pitched shrieking sound that the 2 lieutenants had heard they considered the sound of rapidly expanding and escaping gases. They pointed to conditions in which the aft turret munitions were stored. The cordite for the 8-inch guns had an ignition point of 336 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cordite for the 4.7-inch guns had an ignition point of 334.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet, the munitions were stored in one of the hottest places possible. The magazine for the aft turret was placed between the boilers and the engines, and adjacent to the group of dynamos. The temperature of the compartment sometimes registered at over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Though it was not conclusive evidence of what had occurred, and there were endless unknowns, that at least some of the 8-year-old cordite stored in such volatile temperature conditions might have finally degraded was the most compelling theory put forward as to the fate of the Akidaban. For more information, please see the Colac Herald from April 6, 1906, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.